If you'd asked me a year ago, I'd have said my life was solid. My name's Michael, and at 35, I thought I'd built a strong, dependable foundation, both in my career and my marriage. I run a mid-sized software company that I built from scratch, and my wife, Claire, is a freelance graphic designer with a knack for transforming ideas into art. Together, we had carved out a comfortable life, filled with plans, laughter, and what I believed was mutual respect. We'd been married for 10 years, and those years hadn't been perfect. What marriage is? But I always thought we had something real. We weren't just spouses, we were partners. We had routines, inside jokes, and a rhythm that felt steady, even if life threw the occasional curveball. Claire had always been the social one. While I was more introverted, content to spend an evening at home with a book or a movie, Claire thrived on connection. She had an effortless charm, the kind that made strangers feel like they'd known her forever. I admired that about her, her ability to light up a room, to make people feel special. She also had a strong creative streak. Her freelancing business was thriving, with clients ranging from startups to established brands. Watching her work was mesmerizing. She could spend hours sketching or brainstorming, completely immersed in her process. For the most part, our lives complemented each other. I handled the logical side, finances, planning, long-term goals, while Claire brought color and spontaneity into the mix. It worked, or at least I thought it did. And then there was Daniel, my best friend, my brother from another mother, as we like to joke. We'd known each other since college, where we bonded over late-night study sessions, cheap beer, and the shared struggle of finding our footing in the world. Daniel was the kind of guy who could walk into a room and instantly command attention. Tall, athletic, and charismatic, he had a way of making people feel like they were the center of the universe. He worked in real estate, and his ability to charm clients was unmatched. Over the years, Daniel became a fixture in my life, and by extension, Claire's. He'd been there for our wedding, our housewarming party, our anniversary celebrations. Claire and Daniel got along well, which I always thought was a blessing. There was never any awkwardness or tension. They were friends, just like I was friends with Claire's best friend, Sophie. But now, as I look back, I wonder if I'd missed something. The first hint that things weren't as perfect as they seemed came in subtle ways. Claire started spending more time on her phone, laughing at texts I wasn't privy to. When I asked her what was so funny, she'd wave it off, saying it was just Sophie being Sophie or something equally vague. I didn't press. Claire had always valued her privacy, and I respected that. But still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Our date nights became less frequent, and when they did happen, Claire seemed distracted. She'd check her phone mid-conversation or zone out entirely, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Everything okay?" I asked one evening as we sat across from each other at a cozy Italian restaurant, one of our favorite spots. "Yeah," she said, flashing me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just a lot on my mind. Work stuff." Again, I let it go. Everyone has their moments, right? And then came the dinner, the one that changed everything. It started innocently enough. Claire had cooked one of my favorite meals, and we were sitting at the table, sipping wine and talking about our day. That's when she dropped the bomb. "I went out with Daniel last night," she said, her tone casual, but her expression different. There was a smirk playing on her lips, a challenge in her eyes. "We had fun. You won't mind, right?" The room seemed to tilt, the air suddenly heavy. I stared at her, my mind racing. Was she joking? Testing me? Or was she serious? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I focused on keeping my expression neutral, refusing to give her the reaction she was clearly expecting. "Right," I said finally, my voice calm. "Sounds like you had quite the evening." Her smirk widened, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a fight. Instead, I finished my wine, stood up, and walked away. That night, as I lay awake in bed, her words echoed in my mind. I didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If she thought she could shatter my trust and walk away unscathed, she had no idea who she was dealing with. My silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Because while she thought she was holding all the cards, I was already planning my next move. The morning after Claire's bombshell over dinner, I woke up with a weight on my chest that felt almost unbearable. The memory of her words was like a splinter in my mind, sharp and relentless. I went out with Daniel last night. We had fun. You won't mind, right? What did she mean by fun? The smirk on her face replayed in my head, over and over, like a cruel loop. Was it just dinner? Drinks? Or something else entirely? I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been testing me, daring me to react, to question her. But I hadn't given her the satisfaction. I had stayed calm, silent. And now, that silence was deafening. As I sat at the kitchen table, nursing my coffee and staring blankly at the newspaper, I heard Claire's footsteps behind me. She moved around the kitchen with her usual grace, humming a tune as if nothing had happened. "You're quiet this morning," she said, her voice light. "Just thinking," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Anything interesting?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Not yet," I said, avoiding her gaze. I could feel her watching me as if trying to gauge my mood, but I didn't give her anything to work with. If she wanted to play games, she'd have to play them alone. By midday, my thoughts had turned to Daniel. My best friend, the man who had been by my side through every major milestone in my life. I couldn't reconcile the Daniel I knew with the man Claire had casually mentioned going out with the night before. I needed answers, but I wasn't about to storm into his office or confront him with raw emotion. No, this required strategy. I needed to know what I was dealing with before making my move. I started with a phone call, keeping my voice light and casual. "Hey, Daniel," I said when he picked up. "Got a minute?" "Mark, always for you, buddy," he said, his tone as cheerful as ever. "I've been swamped lately and realized we haven't caught up in a while. How about grabbing a drink tonight? My treat." There was a brief pause on his end, but he quickly recovered. "Sure thing. Let's meet at O'Reilly's around 7. "Perfect," I said, hanging up. That evening, I arrived at the bar a little early, needing time to collect my thoughts. As I sat nursing my beer, I ran through every possible scenario in my head. What would I say? How would he respond? Could I keep my anger in check? When Daniel walked in, all smiles and confidence, it took every ounce of restraint I had not to show my hand. "Mark, my man," he said, clapping me on the shoulder as he sat down. "What's new?" "Not much," I said, forcing a smile. "Just the usual grind. You?" "Oh, you know. Same old," he replied, taking a sip of his drink. For a while, we made small talk, catching up on work and mutual friends. But as the conversation drifted, I decided to test the waters. "So, Claire mentioned you guys hung out last night," I said casually, watching his reaction closely. Daniel froze for the briefest moment, so slight that most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. "Yeah," he said, his tone careful. "She asked if I wanted to grab a drink after work. It was no big deal." "No big deal, huh?" I said, leaning back in my chair. "Of course not," he said, laughing nervously. "You know Claire, she's always been easy to talk to. She just needed to vent about some work stuff." His words were smooth, practiced, but they didn't sit right with me. There was a tension in his voice, a subtle crack in his usually unshakable confidence. As the evening went on, I kept the conversation light, pretending to accept his version of events. But inside, my suspicions only grew. Daniel had always been good at playing it cool, but tonight, he seemed off. When we parted ways, he clapped me on the back and said, "Let's do this again soon, yeah?" "Absolutely," I replied, forcing a smile. But as I watched him walk away, I knew one thing for certain. Daniel wasn't telling me the whole truth. That night, As I sat alone in my apartment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this slide. Claire and Daniel had crossed a line, whether they wanted to admit it or not. And if they thought I was going to sit back and let them get away with it, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The days that followed my conversation with Daniel felt like walking through a fog. On the surface, life went on as usual, work meetings, emails, errands. But beneath the routine was a storm brewing. I couldn't shake the feeling that both Claire and Daniel were hiding something from me, something far more damaging than they wanted to admit. Claire's behavior didn't help. She seemed oddly cheerful, her interactions with me almost exaggerated in their normalcy. She cooked dinner every night, asked about my day, even suggested we plan a weekend getaway, something we hadn't done in years. But I wasn't fooled. Her sudden enthusiasm felt forced, like a magician's sleight of hand meant to distract me from what was really going on. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, I noticed her phone light up with a notification. She quickly picked it up, glancing at the screen before locking it and setting it face down on the coffee table. "Who was that?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Just Sophie," she said without missing a beat. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but my mind was already racing. Sophie was her best friend, sure, but the way Claire had rushed to hide the message didn't sit right. The next morning, while Claire was in the shower, I decided to check her phone. It wasn't something I'd ever done before, and I felt a pang of guilt as I picked it up. But this wasn't about paranoia. It was about finding the truth. Unfortunately, Claire was smarter than I gave her credit for. The text threads were clean, no incriminating messages in sight. If she was hiding something, she was doing a damn good job of covering her tracks. Still, I wasn't deterred. If she thought she could outsmart me, she had another thing coming. I started paying closer attention to the little things. The way her voice softened when she answered certain calls, the subtle changes in her appearance, the way she suddenly seemed to have an endless list of errands to run. Then there was Daniel. I noticed he was texting me less often, his usual barrage of jokes and memes replaced with polite, surface-level exchanges. He seemed to be keeping his distance, and that only fueled my suspicions. It wasn't long before I realized I needed help. I couldn't piece this puzzle together on my own. That's when I reached out to Lucy, a private investigator recommended by a colleague. Meeting Lucy was an eye-opening experience. She was sharp, no nonsense, and had a knack for uncovering the truth. When I explained the situation, she listened intently, taking notes as I spoke. "So you think your wife and your best friend might be having an affair?" she asked, her tone professional but not unsympathetic. "I don't know," I admitted. "But something's going on, and I need to know what it is." Lucy nodded. "Fair enough. I'll start by tracking their movements. See if there's any overlap outside of the usual. If there's something to find, I'll find it." Waiting for Lucy's findings was excruciating. Every moment I spent with Claire felt like a lie, a performance we were both participating in, but for entirely different reasons. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, she looked up and said, "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" "Just busy with work," I said, forcing a smile. She nodded, but her eyes lingered on me a moment too long. Did she suspect I was onto her? Or was she simply trying to gauge how much I knew? When Lucy called me a week later, I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. "I've got something," she said. "Claire and Daniel met at a bar last night. They were there for over 2 hours. I've got photos if you want to see them." My stomach dropped. "Send them over," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. When the photos arrived, they confirmed everything I had feared. There they were, sitting in a dimly lit booth, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Daniel's hand rested lightly on Claire's arm, and the way they leaned toward each other left little room for interpretation. I stared at the photos for what felt like hours, my mind swirling with anger, betrayal, and something else I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the disrespect. They thought they could play me, thought I wouldn't notice the cracks in their facade. But they were wrong. I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to make sure they understood exactly what they had done. And when I was done, they'd both regret ever underestimating me. The day I decided to confront Claire and Daniel was one of those moments that felt surreal, like I was moving through a fog while everything around me stayed sharp and clear. After seeing the photos Lucy had sent, the laughing, the casual intimacy, the way they leaned into each other, I knew I couldn't sit quietly anymore. That morning, Claire was in the kitchen making coffee as if it were just another day. She was humming softly, her back to me, her movements graceful and familiar. But all I could see was the image of her and Daniel, smiling like they were the only two people in the world. "Morning," she said brightly when she noticed me. "Coffee?" "No thanks," I replied, my voice steady but clipped. She turned to look at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "You okay? You've been off lately." "I'm fine," I said, brushing past her to grab my keys. Just a lot on my mind. It wasn't a lie. Instead of heading straight to work, I drove to Daniel's office. My plan wasn't fully formed yet, but I knew I needed to face him first. If anyone owed me answers, it was him. When I arrived, his receptionist greeted me with a smile. "Mr. Davis, good to see you. Daniel's just finishing up a call. Would you like to wait in his office?" Perfect. I walked into his office and took a seat, trying to keep my composure. The desk was immaculate, not a single paper out of place, and a framed photo of the two of us from a college reunion sat proudly in the corner. It was ironic, really, how someone could be so good at maintaining appearances while their actions told a different story. Daniel walked in a few minutes later, his usual confident smile faltering when he saw me. "Mark," he said, his voice careful, "what brings you here?" I stood up, holding my phone in my hand. Without a word, I opened the photo album Lucy had sent me and placed it on his desk. His eyes widened as he stared at the images. "Care to explain this?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp. Daniel tried to recover, his hands raised as if to placate me. "Mark, it's not what it looks like." I let out a bitter laugh. "That's funny, because to me, it looks like my wife and my best friend having a cozy little date night." "It wasn't a date," he said quickly. "She needed someone to talk to, that's all. Things have been tense between you two, and she—" I cut him off. "Don't you dare try to blame this on me. You crossed a line, Daniel, and you knew exactly what you were doing." He shifted uncomfortably, his usual bravado nowhere to be seen. "Look, man, I didn't mean for this to happen. Claire and it's complicated." "No," I said, stepping closer. "It's not complicated. It's betrayal, plain and simple." The conversation escalated from there, his excuses growing weaker by the second. At one point, he tried to play the victim, claiming he had been caught off guard by Claire's feelings. "You expect me to believe that?" I asked, my voice rising. "You've been my friend for over a decade, Daniel, and you threw it all away for what? A few drinks and some laughs?" He didn't respond, his silence more damning than any excuse he could have offered. By the time I left his office, I felt a strange mix of anger and clarity. I had said what I needed to say, and for the first time, I realized that my friendship with Daniel was over. There was no coming back from this. But Claire was a different story. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had made the conscious decision to flaunt it, to test how far she could push me. And now, it was her turn to face the consequences. When I got home that evening, Claire was waiting for me in the living room, her expression unreadable. "How was your day?" she asked, her tone light but cautious. "Interesting," I said, tossing my keys onto the table. She watched me closely, as if sensing the storm brewing beneath the surface. "We need to talk," I said finally, my voice firm. Her smirk from the other night was gone, replaced by something else. Nervousness, perhaps. "Okay," she said, sitting up straighter. "What's on your mind?" I stared at her for a long moment, the weight of everything hanging heavy in the air. "You," I said, "and the lies you've been telling me. Let's start with last night. What exactly did you and Daniel do?" Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "We just talked, Mark. That's all." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice sharper now. "I have photos, Claire. I know exactly where you were and how long you were there. So don't insult my intelligence by pretending it was innocent." Her silence spoke volumes, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in her facade. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was the beginning of the end, and I was ready to see it through. Claire didn't answer right away. She stared at me, her face shifting through a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, guilt, anger, and finally, defiance. It was that last one that stung the most. Not remorse, not regret. Defiance, as if she still believed she could talk her way out of this. "So, you've been spying on me now?" she said, her voice sharp as though I was the one who'd wronged her. "Spying?" I repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. "That's an interesting choice of words. I'd call it uncovering the truth you've been hiding from me." Claire crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing. "What truth, Mark? That I had drinks with a friend? That I needed someone to talk to because you've been too busy with your own life to notice what's going on in mine?" There it was, her attempt to turn this around on me. But I wasn't biting. "Don't you dare try to make this about me," I said, my voice steady but cold. "This isn't about my work schedule or how much time we've spent together. This is about you sneaking around with Daniel, my best friend, Claire. My best friend." She flinched at the words, but quickly recovered. "It wasn't like that," she insisted, though her voice wavered. "You're making it sound worse than it was." "Then tell me," I said, stepping closer. "What was it exactly? What part of sitting in a dark corner booth with your hand on his arm is innocent? What part of laughing at God knows what while your husband is at home working to keep this life together is harmless?" Claire opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in the conversation, she looked unsure, vulnerable. But just as quickly, she straightened her shoulders and adopted a tone of practiced indifference. "It wasn't a big deal, Mark," she said. "I needed someone to vent to, and Daniel was there. That's all." I stared at her, incredulous. "You're really going to stand there and act like this was nothing?" "Because it was nothing," she snapped, her voice rising. "You're blowing this out of proportion. You're acting like I cheated on you." "Didn't you?" I countered, my words landing like a slap in the air between us. Her face paled, and for a moment, the room felt frozen in time. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the cracks in her resolve growing wider. But instead of admitting to anything, she doubled down. "Mark, I didn't cross any lines," she said, her tone almost pleading now. "I didn't sleep with him, I didn't—" "But you wanted to," I interrupted, my voice quiet but firm. "Don't lie to me, Claire. I know what I saw, and even if nothing physical happened, the emotional betrayal is enough." Silence hung between us, heavy and suffocating. Claire sank onto the couch, her hands trembling as she ran them through her hair. For the first time, I saw cracks in the confident, carefree facade she'd worn for so long. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I was just, I don't know, lonely, frustrated. I didn't know how to talk to you about how I was feeling." "So you talked to him instead?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "You turned to the one person you knew would hurt me the most?" She looked up at me, tears brimming in her eyes. "I wasn't thinking about that. I wasn't thinking at all." "That's obvious," I said coldly. "But here's the thing, Claire. Your actions have consequences, and right now I'm questioning everything. Our marriage, our trust, even the kind of person I thought you were." She broke then, the tears spilling over as she buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I've hurt you, and I don't know how to fix this." For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity for her, but it was quickly extinguished by the weight of her betrayal. "Fixing this?" I said. "That's not up to you anymore, Claire. This isn't something you can just patch over with an apology. You broke us, and I'm not sure if we can ever be whole again." I grabbed my jacket and walked toward the door, her sobs echoing behind me. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay in this house, in this life, until I figured out my next move. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and somewhere deep beneath it all, a small spark of clarity. This wasn't just about what Claire had done. It was about what I was willing to accept. And I wasn't ready to let her, or anyone else, dictate my worth. Not anymore. I left the house that night feeling like the ground beneath me had crumbled. The person I thought I knew, the person I had trusted with everything, had betrayed me in the most personal way possible. Yet Claire's tears, her pleas, and her excuses only made me angrier. Not because she cried, but because she still tried to downplay the damage she'd done. I ended up at Josh's place, my lifelong friend who had been through every high and low with me. He opened the door, took one look at me, and said, "What the hell happened?" I stepped inside and sank onto his couch, burying my face in my hands. For a moment, I couldn't find the words, but then it all came out. The dinner, Claire's bombshell confession, the photos, the confrontation. Josh sat silently, listening, his expression growing darker with every word. When I finished, he leaned back and let out a low whistle. Man, I knew Daniel was a bit of a smooth talker, but this is a whole other level. Josh offered me a spare room and a bottle of whiskey, both of which I accepted without hesitation. That first night away from home was strange. The silence of his apartment was unsettling, but it was a different kind of quiet, one without Claire's presence looming over me. The next morning, Josh brewed coffee and sat across from me at the table. "What's the plan, Mark?" "The plan?" I repeated, staring at the black liquid in my mug. "Yeah," he said. "You can't just let this sit. What are you going to do about Claire? About Daniel?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm still trying to process everything." "Well, while you're processing," Josh said, leaning forward, "let me give you some advice. Don't go back there unless you're damn sure it's worth it. She made her choice, Mark. Now it's time for you to make yours." Meanwhile, Claire didn't waste any time trying to reach me. She called, texted, and even sent a long email, pouring her heart out and begging for another chance. Each message was a mix of apologies and justifications. She was lonely, she felt neglected. She didn't mean for things to go so far. "Mark, please, we can fix this." One text read, "I love you. I don't want to lose what we have." But what did we really have? That was the question I couldn't shake. Was our marriage truly strong, or had it been eroding for years without me noticing? As the days turned into weeks, I started to hear whispers about Claire and Daniel from mutual friends. Angela, my sister, was the first to bring it up. "I ran into Sophie," she said over the phone. "She mentioned that people at work are talking about Claire and Daniel. Apparently, this isn't the first time Daniel's been caught in this kind of situation." That revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Daniel, the man I had called my best friend, wasn't just a betrayer. He was a predator. He had likely been playing this game for years, using his charm to manipulate the people closest to him. At the same time, Claire's social circle began to shift. Sophie, her closest friend, reached out to me, her tone cautious. "I don't know what's going on between you and Claire," she said, "but she's been acting different lately. Distant, secretive. And now people are starting to talk." "Talk about what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "About her and Daniel. Sophie admitted. I don't want to get involved, but you deserve to know that this isn't just a one-time thing. People have noticed them together outside of work. The fallout wasn't just social, it was personal. Friends who had once celebrated our relationship now chose sides. Some defended Claire, arguing that I must have neglected her for her to stray. Others stood by me, disgusted by both her betrayal and Daniel's actions. Josh, as always, was blunt. Anyone who takes her side doesn't deserve to be in your life. Angela, meanwhile, took it a step further. She didn't just betray you, Mark, she humiliated you. And Daniel, he's trash. Cut them both out and don't look back. Despite the support, I couldn't help but feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. I wasn't just dealing with the end of a marriage. I was grappling with the loss of trust, of stability, of the future I had envisioned. But as I sat in Josh's apartment one evening, staring out the window at the city lights, I realized something. I wasn't powerless. I had the ability to take control, to rebuild, to start over. Claire and Daniel had taken enough from me. They wouldn't take my future too. The next step was clear. It was time to move forward, with or without her. As word of my crumbling marriage spread, the division among friends and family became painfully clear. It was like someone had drawn an invisible line, and people had chosen sides without fully understanding the story. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, whether I wanted to hear it or not. Josh, my rock through all this, had no patience for anyone defending Claire or Daniel. He wasn't shy about voicing his opinion either. Mark, he said one night, beer in hand, anyone who tries to justify what they did isn't worth your time. Period. They don't see the betrayal because they've never been blindsided like this. I couldn't argue with him. Josh had been unwavering in his support, but his loyalty also brought a certain fire to our conversations. He wanted me to cut ties with anyone who even remotely hinted at siding with Claire. On the other side was Claire's sister, Rachel. She called me unexpectedly, her voice careful and measured, as if she was stepping onto a fragile bridge. Mark, I know you're hurting, she began. But Claire's been struggling too. She made a mistake, a big one, but she's not a bad person. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my voice steady. Rachel, you don't get it. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice, a repeated, deliberate choice to betray me. I know, she said softly. I'm not excusing her. I don't want to see you two throw everything away without trying to fix it. Her words lingered with me long after the call ended. Fixing it? Was that even possible? Mutual friends were the trickiest. Some reached out to show their support, while others tried to stay neutral, as if their silence was a form of diplomacy. But there were a few who shocked me with their takes. You know, Mark, one friend said over drinks, maybe Claire acted out because she felt neglected. You're always so busy with work. Maybe she just needed attention. I stared at him, stunned by his audacity. So you're saying this is my fault? I asked, my voice dangerously low. No, he stammered. I'm just saying relationships are complicated. Maybe she didn't know how to communicate what she was missing. Right, I said, setting down my drink. And her solution was to find it with my best friend? He had no response, and I didn't stick around to wait for one. Angela, my sister, was a fierce advocate for me throughout it all. She didn't mince words when it came to Claire or anyone defending her. Mark, you've got to cut these people out, she said during one of our late-night calls. If they can't see how wrong this is, they're not worth your energy. Her bluntness was refreshing, even if it didn't always ease the ache in my chest. But then there was Sophie, Claire's best friend, who threw me for a loop. She called me one evening, her voice hesitant. Mark, I'm not defending what Claire did, she said, but I think she's genuinely remorseful. She knows she screwed up. She's been crying nonstop and saying she'd do anything to fix this. Her words should have stirred something in me. Hope, maybe, or compassion. But they didn't. All I felt was a deep, hollow exhaustion. Sophie, I said, cutting her off. If she wanted to fix this, she wouldn't have let it happen in the first place. The tension among friends and family was exhausting. Everywhere I turned, it felt like someone had an opinion, a judgment, or unsolicited advice. But through it all, one thing became clear. I couldn't base my decisions on what others thought. This was my life, my marriage, my pain. And ultimately, I was the one who had to decide what came next. No one else could do that for me. Not Josh, not Rachel, not Sophie. This was my choice, and I was finally ready to start making it. After weeks of soul-searching, anger, and sleepless nights, I knew it was time to face Claire again. This time, there would be no shouting, no accusations, and no futile attempts to decipher the truth from half-hearted explanations. This was about clarity, closure, and making my next move. I texted her. "We need to talk. Let's meet somewhere neutral. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. Her reply came almost immediately. "Of course. Name the place." I chose a quiet cafe downtown, one that had always been my sanctuary. It felt poetic in a way to bring the storm into a place that had always brought me peace. When I arrived, Claire was already there, sitting at a corner table. She looked different, worn, like the weeks apart had weighed on her as heavily as they had on me. She glanced up as I approached, offering a tentative smile. "Mark," she said softly. "Claire," I replied, taking a seat across from her. For a moment we sat in silence, the tension between us palpable. She fiddled with her coffee cup while I kept my hands firmly clasped on the table, waiting for her to speak. "I'm glad you wanted to meet," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us, about what I did." I didn't respond, keeping my expression neutral. Let her talk. She took a deep breath and continued. "I know I've hurt you, Mark, more than I can ever put into words. And I hate myself for it. I hate that I betrayed your trust, that I jeopardized everything we built together." Her voice cracked, and tears welled up in her eyes, but I remained silent. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel and I, it started as nothing, just harmless conversations. I didn't see it for what it was until it was too late." I leaned forward slightly, my gaze fixed on her. "And what exactly was it, Claire? Be honest with me. No more excuses." She looked away, guilt etched across her face. "We kissed," she admitted. "It happened more than once, but it never went further than that. I swear to you, Mark. I never slept with him." I felt a sharp pang in my chest, but I kept my composure. "Do you think that makes it better?" I asked quietly. "That it was just kissing? Claire, you didn't just betray me physically. You broke the emotional bond we had. You chose him over me, over us, over everything we built together." Her tears spilled over and she shook her head. "I wasn't choosing him. I was lost, Mark. I felt invisible, like we were living parallel lives instead of sharing one. And Daniel, he was just there. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in so long." "That's not an excuse," I said firmly. "If you felt that way, you could have come to me. You could have talked to me, told me how you felt. Instead, you turned to someone else. You let him come between us." "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know I should have handled things differently. But I want to make it right, Mark. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Please, just give me another chance." For the first time, I let the silence linger, allowing her words to hang in the air. I could see the desperation in her eyes, the raw emotion in her voice. But I could also feel the weight of her betrayal, the cracks in my trust that no apology could mend. "I've thought about this a lot," I said finally, my voice steady. "And the truth is, I don't know if I can ever trust you again. What we had, it's gone, Claire. You destroyed it the moment you crossed that line with Daniel." She reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on mine. "Mark, please," she begged. "Don't give up on us. We can rebuild. I'll do whatever it takes." I pulled my hand away, shaking my head. "This isn't just about rebuilding, Claire. It's about respect, trust, and the foundation of our relationship. And right now, that foundation is shattered." Her sobs were quiet, but heart-wrenching, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of pity. But pity wasn't enough to save us. "I need to move on," I said, standing up. "And so do you. I hope you figure out what you're looking for, Claire, but it's not with me." As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a strange mix of emotions: grief for what I had lost, relief for the decision I had made, and a faint glimmer of hope for what lay ahead. This wasn't the ending I had envisioned for my marriage, but it was the one I needed. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was finally taking control of my life again. The days after my final conversation with Claire were oddly quiet, almost serene. The decision had been made. The divorce papers were filed. There was no going back now. Still, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The loss of what once was, the betrayal that had forced my hand, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Claire, for her part, didn't give up easily. She sent me messages, emails, even a handwritten letter that arrived in the mail one rainy afternoon. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the envelope for what felt like hours before finally opening it. Her words were raw, emotional, and full of regret. She admitted that she'd been selfish, that she had let her insecurities and frustrations push her into making decisions that shattered our trust. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Mark," she wrote. "But I hope one day you can understand why I made the mistakes I did. I'll regret losing you for the rest of my life." The letter stayed on the table for days. I didn't respond. What could I say? The damage was done, and no amount of apologies could undo it. While I was picking up the pieces of my life, Claire's world was crumbling. Word about her affair with Daniel spread quickly, and her professional reputation took a hit. Clients began distancing themselves, wary of the drama that seemed to follow her. As for Daniel, his charm had finally run its course. Mutual friends who once idolized him turned their backs when they learned of his betrayal. He lost business deals, social connections, and, ultimately, the respect of those who had once admired him. From what I heard, Claire and Daniel didn't last long. Whatever spark they thought they had fizzled out under the weight of reality. Daniel moved on to someone else, another co-worker, unsurprisingly, and Claire was left to face the consequences alone. I should have felt vindicated, but I didn't. Watching Claire and Daniel fall apart didn't erase the pain or make me feel any better about what had happened. If anything, it reinforced the sense of loss that lingered in the background of my everyday. But I refused to let their mistakes define me. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my life, one step at a time. I started therapy, something I'd never considered before. My therapist, a calm and insightful woman named Dr. Bennett, helped me unpack the betrayal and find clarity amidst the chaos. She reminded me that Claire's actions didn't reflect my worth, and that healing would take time but was entirely possible. I also reconnected with old friends, people I'd drifted away from during my marriage. Friday nights became about beer and laughter at Josh's place or poker games with a group of guys I hadn't seen in years. Bit by bit, I started to feel like myself again. One afternoon, as I was organizing my apartment, I came across an old photo album Claire and I had put together during our first year of marriage. Flipping through the pages, I felt a pang of sadness, but also a strange sense of peace. Those memories were real, even if they were overshadowed by what came later. And while the marriage didn't last, it had shaped me into the person I was now, someone stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. I closed the album and placed it on a high shelf. It was a part of my past, but it didn't have to define my future. As I stood there, looking out the window at the city skyline, I felt a small flicker of hope. My life wasn't over. It was just beginning again, on my terms. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled. The day my divorce was finalized, I walked out of the courthouse with a mixture of emotions I could barely describe. There was relief, certainly. Relief that the legal ties to Claire had been severed, that the chapter of betrayal and heartbreak was officially closed. But there was also sadness, a hollow ache for what could have been. The life we'd planned together was gone, reduced to memories and paperwork. As I stepped into the sunlight, I took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill my lungs. It felt like a small, symbolic gesture, the start of something new, even if I didn't know what that something was yet. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rediscovering myself. For too long, I had been Mark, Claire's husband, and somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten how to just be Mark. Therapy helped me confront the scars left by the betrayal, and Dr. Bennett encouraged me to embrace the things that made me happy, no matter how small or insignificant they seemed. I returned to running, hitting the trails at dawn when the world was quiet and still. There was something cathartic about the rhythm of my feet on the ground, the steady beat of my heart, the simple act of moving forward. I also picked up photography again, a hobby I'd abandoned years ago. It started with a secondhand camera I found at a thrift store, and soon I was spending weekends exploring the city, capturing moments of beauty in the ordinary, sunlight streaming through a window, a child laughing in a park, the intricate details of an old brick wall. It was during one of these weekend excursions that I met Hannah. She was leading a community art walk, her enthusiasm infectious as she explained the stories behind murals and sculptures scattered throughout the neighborhood. I was struck by her warmth, her genuine interest in connecting with people and the world around her. At the end of the walk, as the group began to disperse, I found myself lingering, wanting to talk to her more. "You have a good eye," she said, nodding toward the camera slung over my shoulder. "Thanks," I replied, smiling. "It's a work in progress." "Aren't we all?" she said with a grin. Our conversation was easy, flowing naturally from art to books to travel. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about Claire or Daniel or the mess they'd left behind. I was simply in the moment, enjoying the company of someone new. Over the next few weeks, Hannah and I began spending more time together. She introduced me to her favorite hiking trails, and I showed her my favorite hidden coffee shops. Our connection was quiet but undeniable, built on shared interests and a mutual respect for each other's journeys. One evening, as we sat on a bench overlooking the city skyline, I told her about Claire, about the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the long road to finding myself again. I expected her to look uncomfortable, maybe even pull away. Instead, she reached out and took my hand. "Thank you for sharing that," she said softly. "It's brave to be honest about your pain. It means you're ready to heal." Her words stayed with me long after that night. For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was living again. Looking back, I realized that Claire's betrayal, as devastating as it had also been a turning point. It forced me to confront my own worth, to let go of a relationship that had been built on shaky ground, and to rediscover the strength I didn't know I had. Hannah wasn't a replacement for what I'd lost. She was proof that life could move forward, that new connections could be forged, and that happiness could be found in unexpected places. As we walked back to the car that night, hand in hand, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was also full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace it.